bit, and it never makes it past the first desk. Okay, we're going to continue on talking about 19th century, 18th, 19th century art. Moving through some movements. What we find is after the Enlightenment, many of our art movements are based around ideas rather than around just simple countries and periods. So when we talked about the Renaissance, we talked about the Baroque, we really were just sort of identifying various movements based on particular sort of political entities, right? How was Dutch Baroque different from Italian Baroque, for example, and having to do with religion and whatnot, right? And what we saw when we looked at Dutch Baroque was really the beginnings of art that is not necessarily controlled by the church anymore, right? Art that is controlled really more by the open art market. And with that, we began to see a sort of waning of religious themes. In fact, we're pretty much done with religious themes after the 17th century. And as we moved into the 18th century, we continued to see sort of secular, non-Christian themes developing. And as we get to the Enlightenment, we're seeing that the art is very much motivated by ideas. And with those ideas comes something also that I think is really important for the development of Western art. And that is the idea that artists feel that their works of art have agency. And what I mean by that is that we often look at art, and we often try to, really up until this period, we've been talking about art as reflecting ideas and culture. Right? That there are things that are going on out there, there are religious concepts that we find echoes of, reflections of in art. And what we find when we get to the Enlightenment and beyond is there's a sense on the artist's mind that they can actually make works of art that affect social change. That instead of simply reflecting the ideas of others, they can have an impact on the ideas of others. Does that make sense? In other words, it's not a passive agent, art isn't anymore. Artists are looking at art as a statement that can change things for people. And this really does come out of the Enlightenment. So Voltaire was the one who really established this idea that we should study history with the idea that by learning history we become better citizens, that we learn examples of virtue, right? They called it exemplum virtutis. These examples of virtue that help us navigate our world, right? Through studying history. And our paintings are very much sort of based on that same kind of theme, where they're presenting us examples of virtue that can give us something to fall back on when we're thinking and making tough decisions in our community, right? However we define that community, our culture, right? So we started off looking primarily at France to begin with, and Jacques-Louis David and his relationship to politics at the time. And then we're moving over to England and looking at Angelica Kauffmann, a Swiss expatriate living in England, using the scene from Roman history of a mother teaching her children how to behave properly and teaching her children of their social responsibility. Her older child is responsible for the younger one, right? And both of them, the boys at least, will grow up to be Roman consuls, leaders of Rome, right, in the 2nd century BC. And both of them will, according to Roman history, be great champions of the rights of the common man, of equality, these great sort of Enlightenment virtues. And for our Kauffman, she chalks it all up to good parenting. And what we find in society at the time is that exactly when she's doing this, there is a great call for more direct connections between children and their parents. No more sort of workhouses and boarding schools are sort of the idea of that is being questioned. The idea of using wet nurses as opposed to direct maternal connections is being questioned by some of our Enlightenment philosophers. And this seems to tie into that exact idea, right? So remember that Cornelia is visited by her neighbors who's very materialistic and says, I've got all these jewels, what do you got? And she goes, I got my kids, right? They're my jewels. And so valuing that idea of parenting. with Copley, another British artist, had grown up in the colonies, had grown up in America before America was independent, so while it was still British, had moved back to London at the outbreak of the War of Independence because he was a British sympathizer. He was a Tory. His father was attacked in the Boston Tea Party, right? Had his holdings attacked by the rebels in the Boston Tea Party. It depicts this image of this shark attack in Cuba, in the Havana Harbor, where Brooke Watson, who, when he paints this, is now Lord Mayor of London. This is an event from his childhood, how he lost his leg, right? And what Copley wants to illustrate with this image is, again, an example of virtue, perhaps a political allegory as well, working together to save one of your own, right? Historical scene, even though it's a relatively recent historical scene. 1749, I think, is when this happened, right? So it's relatively recent history. But bonding together to save one of your own, or perhaps even a political allegory where Brooke Watson, as a representative of England, right, has lost his leg in the New World. And England once had a leg in the New World, America, and they'd recently lost it, right? So it could be seen as a sort of a political allegory as well. But one of the things that we see artists doing at this time is becoming not only sort of aware of the power their works might have to affect the way people think, right? To change society for the better, to be socially responsible with what they do. That's one thing that we're seeing that's particularly modern. And the other thing that I think is particularly modern about these works is the degree to which they are self-reflective. And by that I mean they are very self-consciously quoting earlier works of art, right? Mirroring other examples. We saw this with Jacques-Louis David as well, right? Mirroring other examples. And when you see that, and when you recognize it, and skilled viewers in the 18th century would have recognized it, right? We have to take art history classes now. But they were on their game when they were looking at pictures, right? They knew what they were doing. And they would recognize these reference points because they were more visual culture in a different way than we are, right? Just as we would recognize references to pop culture things, right? When we see things, The Simpsons quoting a Coen Brothers movie or something, we get it. You know, they would have got it. And that self-reflectivity, if you will, right? That self-consciousness of art as adding into a long-standing dialogue, visual dialogue, is also very modern, right? And it also makes us aware that the painting is an artifice of sorts. It's a creation of the artist. Because they're so intent on sort of quoting earlier works of art to add to the meaning. But what that does is it adds to the sense that art is a artificial creation, right? Yeah, Khadijah.
Is it similar to genre painting?
Well, this is kind of, in a way, but genre painting is not, this is, the relationship of genre painting and what we're seeing here is a little complicated. It's a very good question. Genre painting, of course, born in Holland, right, or the Low Countries, and we started to see with things like your picture, right, your ill-matched lovers that we looked at in class as well, but also really saw it take off in the 17th century, right, with Vermeer, right, etc. Vermeer we looked at as much as anybody that way. Genre paintings are scenes of everyday life, and the thing about a genre painting is it's not necessarily a newsworthy event, right? It's a scene of sort of just something that you would look past normally, but look at it more closely. And I think for us, genre paintings is a really important step in breaking away from ostensibly, overtly religious imagery to trying to look elsewhere for these lessons about life and behavior and whatnot. And these are similar in that respect. But the difference is, of course, that they're historical pictures, right? And a genre picture is and they're also event-based, right? So the one on the right is historical pictures, 2nd century BC, so it's not a scene of everyday life, right? Contemporary everyday life. The one on the left might be contemporary, but it's kind of a newsy event, right? And that sets it apart from genre scenes, because there's nothing in a genre scene that's particularly newsworthy, right? And so the things that are newsworthy sort of fit under a different umbrella, right? But what they do share definitely which comes right out of genre painting. This idea that we're going to look at that and we're going to see beyond just the description of this everyday event to something else that might have greater significance. I think the big difference between the two is this idea of social justice, right? I don't think Quentin Matsuy's Vermeer is looking at their pictures as having any great sort of impact on how people thought, right? I think they're definitely filled with meanings that make them more interesting the longer you look at them, but do they see that as an agent of social change? And that sense of social responsibility, which I think is an important thing for, what do you take out of this class when you walk away and you leave Marymount, you graduate, that's our history class, where I remember, okay, cool, there's a shark. But I would think that there's some issues that might make us better people as well, sort of like idea. So the idea that whatever you do, what's your major? IT. You can have an impact, right? Easier to say with that than art history. But, right, you can have an impact. What we do potentially changes the world, right? However insignificant we might think we are. God knows we just saw a black hole, right? What makes you feel more insignificant than the idea that this thing's 65 million light years across, or something like that, right? 6.5 billion times bigger than the sun. I read that this morning, right? Feel really insignificant, but it's not, because you can change the world around you, right? And that's a bigger lesson here, right, that we can take away from this, is that these artists are very much aware of the degree to which their works of art have the potential to affect social change. But you got to make it happen, right? It's not just going to happen by itself. It's not like mold on bread, right? You got to make it happen, right? Okay, so Watson is, as we saw at the end of class, is this Lord Mayor of London in the 1770s, and this is an event from roughly 30 years earlier when he's a youth gone swimming off the coast of Cuba in the Havana Harbor, got attacked by a shark, lost his leg, right? To make the image speak the message, right? Attacked by the monster from the sea. Copley looks back, and this is typical for neoclassical artists, looks back at ancient art, looks back for prototypes to other classical periods. So he looks back to ancient Greece and finds this very well-known statue of the priest of the city of Troy, who tried to warn his fellow Trojans not to take the horse, right? Beware strangers bearing gifts. He thinks something's up. And King Neptune, the god of the sea, who's on the side of the Greeks against the Trojans, wants to shut him up. So Neptune sends serpents to silence Laocoon and his sons. And you can see that the pose of Brooke Watson derives from either Laocoon himself or maybe the sun on the left, right? Are pulled into this. And what he's doing is he's trying to amplify the meaning by using these classical prototypes, right? And then at the end of class, we were looking at Raphael, another classical prototype. The Renaissance is a very classical period. St. Michael slaying the demon. This work is in Rome. Copley had traveled to Rome, right? Most artists did, to go see the great works of the Renaissance and antiquity. The Laocoon is in Rome. It's in the Vatican collection. So it's this. And he uses the man at the helm of the boats trying to spear the shark. He bases that basic pose on Raphael's St. Michael, spearing a demon. So again, it adds to the meaning, right? And the figures on the side of the boat who are trying to rescue Brooke Watson also derive from a well-known Raphael that Copley could have seen actually in London. This was a sketch that Raphael had done. We call it a sketch. The term meant something different back then. It's a preparatory drawing, a preparatory watercolor for a tapestry that was woven based on this to hang underneath the Sistine ceiling in the Sistine Chapel, right? Commissioned by the Pope. And the actual drawings, which were full-size, used to lay out the tapestries, then were bought and wound up in London. And so Copley would have known this one as well. And we can see this is where Christ tells the disciples who are coming up empty-handed that if you cast your nets on the other side of the boat, you'll catch some fish. And miraculously, their nets are filled to overflowing right? And if we look at the figures behind, so there's Jesus on the left, his apostles going, what do you talk? And on the right, we see the apostles pulling in the nets. And those figures are then transliterated, if you will, by Copley. So this becomes a miraculous salvation, right? Miraculous saving of Watson from the powers of the sea, right? So all of the different quotes that Copley uses are quotes that add to the meaning. But again, they make us very aware that this is artificial, right? That this is a creation of the artist, right? In America, we see neoclassicism as well. And you've probably seen this. There are two different versions of it, right? One's in the White House, and the other one's in the Smithsonian American Museum in the National Portrait Gallery, right? The famous Lansdowne portrait. There's so many portraits of George Washington, and each one picks up a nickname based on previous owners, right? This one's known as the Lansdowne portrait of George Washington. Gilbert Stuart was his single favorite portrait painter, although many people painted Washington through the course of his career. And in this case, you can see what Stuart has done, typical for neoclassicism, is he looked to the art of the past for the pose, right? Looked to a classical period of history, again, back to ancient Greece. And the famous Apollo Belvedere, which is in the Vatican collection in Rome. Very, very well known, right? Open to the public. Any artist who travels to Rome will see this thing, and you don't even have to because it's available in reproductions everywhere, prints showing us the basic pose. And in Washington's time, right, late 18th century, a famous art critic, Winckelmann, German, had written about ancient Greek art and was the one person that artists read when it came to learning about ancient Greek art. And Stuart would have known Winckelmann's works. And Winckelmann said that the Apollo Belvedere was the paragon. It was the best work of classical Greek art anywhere. It was unparalleled in its perfection, right? It is the perfect Greek sculpture. And that was kind of the idea that was shared by everybody around 1800, was that the Apollo Belvedere was the perfect Greek sculpture. And so it makes sense that when Gilbert Stuart is going to find a Greek sculpture to model George Washington after, right, then that this would be it. He's the perfect American, right? Why not use the perfect Greek sculpture? And what he does is he translates that pose now into something that means something more. So what this portrait is over life size, right? It's about 7 feet tall. The portrait is commissioned to commemorate Washington stepping down as president at the end of his second term. Now, this is a huge moment in American history, the two-term president, because it's right at the time that Napoleon is rising to power. And there was some fear that Washington, who had been a military general first, now leader of the country, that might parlay into becoming a king, becoming ruler for life, right? Because they're seeing what's happening in France, and Napoleon's not on the throne yet, but there's this fear that our experiment in democracy might be stillborn, right? It might die in infancy. And had Washington decided to stay on, then it becomes this idea that the presidency is a position for life, and nobody wants that, right? We want term limits. We want to have the people intervene periodically to talk about who we want to run the country. That's what democracy is all about. So this is a momentous moment in American history. Washington saying, I'm done, right? Somebody else take up the charge, right? I'm going to retire. I'm going to become a man of letters. I'm going to go back to my farm in Virginia, right? Somebody else can take it up. But he could have stayed on. had he wanted to, right? It was popular enough. So this is a huge thing. Right? And what Stuart has done is he's translated the pose of Belvedere. Now he's reversed it, probably knew it through a print, right? An engraving which would have been reversed the pose. So that the hand down at the side is holding his sword pointed downward, which is a symbol of resignation. I'm done fighting. My sword is pointed downward. He has risen from the presidential chair, looks kind of like a throne, got the crest of the United States on the back of it, right? He's leaving it unoccupied for someone else. And he's gesturing over to the table, where you can see directly beneath his hand is a quill pen. So just like with Jacques-Louis David in Marat, we have the sword and the pen juxtaposed. He's giving up the life of the sword for the life of the pen, right? The active man will become the thoughtful man. Right? A man of action becomes a man of ideas. Right? That's the moment he's capturing here. Right? Now, this pose of Washington with his arm out and one arm down to the side is sort of picked up by artists all over the place, right? This is one of the murals in the Capitol Dome. Washington died, 1799, I think? So this is 25 years after his death. One of the murals to commemorate the founding of the country. And there's Washington, and this is the point where Washington is about to take up being president. So here he's been leader of the Continental Army, right? And he's stepping down. I am no longer general. I'm now going to be a political leader. It's kind of another major point in his career where he's shifting gears, right? Changing hats, if you will. And you'll notice as he hands over his resignation letter that the pose ends up again mirroring the Apollo Belvedere, right? Because he is in fact the perfect American, just as the Apollo Belvedere is the perfect Greek statue, right? Right. So there we see the sword I was talking about pointed downward as a symbol of resignation. And the other hand gesturing over books. He's now turning to the life of the mind. He's got, I love his little doggy basin for his ink and pens, right? Rests on a couple of hounds' backs. The carpet pulled up over the table so we can see this wonderful leg where it's decorated with American eagles, right, down below. And if we look further down, we see what he's up to. He's writing books, and he's writing, he's got there below him the Constitution, right, a history of the American Revolution. The leg of the table is fashioned to look as if it was a bunch of sticks that are bound together with ribbon, right? This is an old Roman theme called fasces, F-A-S-C-E-S. It's where the medical term comes from for some of the bands in our bodies. And it's the basis of the idea that working together, we're stronger than we are as individuals, right? A bunch of sticks, little sticks, can break individually, but bound together they are strong, right? This is e pluribus unum, right? Out of many comes one. It's everywhere in American decoration, right? And here it fits with Washington very, very well, right? That idea of out of many comes one, stronger than any individual. And Washington's leadership has brought this into being, right? That's the message of the image. And by stepping down, as he gestures over, you'll notice that directly behind his elbow, there's a rainbow outside. Rainbows might just be decorative, but we know for a fact that biblically, the rainbow is a sign of hope. It's a sign of the promise of God that the flood of Noah would never happen again. Right? That we will never encounter that kind of purge from God's hand again. The rainbow was God's promise of a brighter future growing out of a turbulent past. That's exactly how Stuart is using it. Thinking of the War of Revolution as this flood, right? This trying time out of which now we are in the promised land, right? Moved through to dry pastures beyond after the purging of sin. So lots of little messages coming up out of this work is in fact typical for neoclassicism based on ancient art, which simply adds to the overall meaning, right? Now we're going to look to another movement that's taking place at exactly the same time as neoclassicism. And this movement is called Romanticism. It's similar to neoclassicism in that it's a reaction to the Rococo. When we talked about Rococo art, early 18th century art, what we had seen was that the Rococo was very lighthearted. Couples frolicking in gardens, right? The goddess of love with Cupid, controlling people, falling in love. It was very, very frivolous, right? Very lighthearted, very decorative in its painting style. And what we saw was that with the Enlightenment, neoclassicism gets really, really deeply serious, right? And begins to also recognize the artist's responsibility as a member of the community, right? Romanticism is also deeply, deeply serious, right? Not at all lighthearted. And it's also very much influenced by the Enlightenment, but by a different strand. And what we see is that it begins right around the same time as neoclassicism, each of them reacting differently to the Rococo, each of them channeling different elements of Enlightenment philosophy. So neoclassicism is Voltaire. Voltaire's ideas about social responsibility, about learning from the past to become good citizens, right? And to serve the community. It's very altruistic, right? The individual's job is to become an important part of society. Romanticism is based on another Enlightenment philosopher, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And Rousseau's most famous quote is that mankind was born to be free, but is everywhere in chains. And this leads the Romantics in poetry, theater, painting, in this case printmaking, right, leads the Romantics to focus on the freedom of mankind, freedom from restraint. And that led to a focus on the importance of individuality, right, rather than the importance of social responsibility. So what the Romantics champion in works of art that we find is this idea of the freedom of the individual. This is also, as you can see, a very important element of sort of the move for the American Revolution, for the French Revolution, this idea of the importance of individual rights, right? And as the Romantics begin to focus on individuality, their works of art begin to focus on subjectivity, right? What makes you an individual, your own subjective way of looking at the world, right? So Romantics become interested in images of subjectivity rather than social duty, right? With subjectivity becomes an interest in irrational fears rather than rational motivations. At the same time, they're not they don't think we should have these irrational fears. They think that rationality can overcome them, but they're warning us against the dangers of those irrational fears. The focus ends up on the sort of fearsome. And so what we see with Romanticism at the same time as neoclassicism are images that focus on themes where constraints disappear, where rationality maybe is gone, where subjectivity comes to the forefront. So we're going to look, as we look at Romantic art today and on Monday, is images that are interested in dreams. Dreams is where we're our most subjective. Dreams are kind of where we're illogical in a way. And that becomes a prominent theme in romantic art and in literature, right? Images of insanity become really important to the Romantics because insanity is not bound by anything. It's free entirely. Images of death become really important to the Romantics, where all constraints are gone. And images of nature. Nature in its sort of extraordinary power, more powerful than the works of man. These become important themes for the Romantics. Right? So here on the left with Goya, Francisco Goya, we're looking at a Spanish artist. We haven't seen much of them. We talked about Velázquez and Ribera and a few Spanish artists in the 17th century, but we haven't looked at them very much. Right? And this is a print. Well, I think we'll talk a little bit more about the printmaking process. It's part of a series of prints that he did. You can see it's numbered in the upper right corner, called Los Caprichos, which basically means the follies, the caprices in English, right? The follies. And the series is intended, it's 82 prints issued as a series that are meant to illustrate the foolishness of mankind, right? All of our lunacy, all of our idiocy, all of those places where our individual ideas, our subjective nature makes us stupid. And the idea is, of course, to be somewhat humorous, but not, these aren't particularly funny, but make us then realize that there's something to be said for rationality. But the focus isn't on the rational, right? Like neoclassical artists, the focus is on the irrational. To use it as a negative example, if you will, of how to behave. So on the right, it's very rare to find it in book form. The National Gallery has one of the bound as a book during Goya's lifetime, right? And as you can see, number 43, and as you can see in the book, it's about halfway through, a little bit more than halfway through, is this image, which apparently he originally intended to be the frontispiece, the very first image, but then decided instead to put a portrait of himself in the front and stuck this kind of in the middle, right? And it shows a man dreaming and what goes on in his mind while he's dreaming, right? We'll come back to that in just a second. The series, right, this is the one right before it in the sequence, number 42. Many of the follies of mankind are just stupid acts that are kind of silly. So a donkey is a beast of burden. Donkeys are bred to carry around things that we don't want to carry around. That's the whole point of having a donkey, a burro, right? Is they're beasts of burden. And obviously it's pure stupidity to carry around a beast of burden on your own back, because it negates the whole point of having a beast of burden, right? So some of the images in the Caprichos are really silly, right? But some of them are extraordinarily dark, right? Some of them are very, very evil, where our fears become real and attack us, right? Where our nightmares are everywhere to be seen. And by not showing, for example, the face of this figure that appears to the woman, she can obviously see it. The children can. It's utterly terrifying. And frightening images are kind of part and parcel of Romanticism. Goya is very, very good at it, right? So our image on the left, the best known of the entire series, roughly halfway through the book, shows what happens when our subjectivity crowds out our rationality. The sleep of reason, right? When I was undergrad, I heard that title, sitting in our history class, and I thought, a sleep where you reason things out, right? But what Goya means is that when reason falls asleep, right, the sleep of reason, that when reason falls asleep, monsters appear, right? And so what we see is the writer. He's got pens and paper, could be the artist, falling asleep at his writing desk, and right into the desk is in Spanish the title of the piece, right? And what happens as he falls asleep is reason disappears, right? And when reason disappears, monsters appear. But when we're reasonable, we know there's nothing under the bed, right? We know there's nothing in the closet. It's only when we're unreasonable that we realize this. Right? And so it's very Enlightenment in its thinking, in that it's talking about the importance of rationality, right? It's extolling the importance. But what the artist does to do that is to focus on these darker images, which is what makes it romantic in outline. Right? So we see him now perplexed by the things in his mind, right? The creatures of the night, a lynx, an owl, bats, right? That are what's going on in his head as reason has fallen asleep. Now, Goya is very much interested in sort of the darker impulses of man. That seems to be something he focuses on a lot. Many other artists do as well during the Romantic period, but Goya perhaps as much as anybody. And part of this came from his own life. Part of it came from the period in which he lived. He had pneumonia in the 1790s, had gone stone deaf, literally couldn't hear a thing. And it slowly drove him mad, right? But from the get-go, he felt himself to be an outsider looking in. Because the world around him, people were talking, and he was alienated from that. And because of this, he ends up looking at society and all of the structures of society very, very critically, right? He sees himself, so even because this is Spain, the church is very strong still. He doesn't really want anything to do with that, right? He oddly becomes the court painter to the King of Spain. I don't know how that all worked out. In fact, his portraits of court members look like cartoons. He makes them look as ugly as they could possibly be, and I don't know how he got away with it, right? But again, he's sort of the self-appointed critic, right? Living outside of the structures of society. In addition to that, Spain is very, very troubled in the early 19th century, politically speaking, right? And Goya witnessed the follies of mankind in the worst possible way firsthand. Spain was racked by war beginning in 1808. So what Goya imagines in the late 1790s, he actually sees happen around 1810. And he gives us an account of something that he had seen in 1808, painted 6 years later, in 1814. The slaughter of innocent war prisoners in the middle of the night. And gives us this wrenching scene in kind of all of its gore and guts, unflinching. There's a lot of sort of icky images in the Romantic period. They seem to be focusing on death and destruction as part of this idea of irrationality as a theme. Now, historically speaking, like I said, Goya worked for the King of Spain, Carlos IV. He was the court painter to Carlos IV of Spain. In 1808, Napoleon, our old friend from France, decides he wants to govern Spain as well. Part of his imperial ambition is to rule all of Europe, right? To make a new Roman Empire with himself in France as the new emperor, right? So part of his ambition is to conquer Germany and Spain and reunify Europe under one leader, just like it had been in the Middle Ages and before that in the Roman Empire. So that means conquering Spain. And he's able, Napoleon is, to sow seeds of doubt about Carlos's ability to rule. right? Rumors of him being manipulated by certain court members turned public opinion against Carlos. And in 1808, there's a small uprising against Carlos that Napoleon exploits. And he tells Carlos, come to France, I'll send troops in, we'll stop the riot, and then you can get back on the throne again, everything will be fine. Right? So Carlos says, cool, great idea. I'll come cross the Pyrenees, go to Biarritz, France. Right? And Napoleon immediately has him arrested. Right? Locked up. It's a trick. And Napoleon then installs his own brother, Joseph Bonaparte, as the new king of Spain in 1808. Okay? And he stays there until 1814. So for 6 years, the French are the rulers of Spain as part of Napoleon's attempts to colonize all of Europe. Right? We already talked about Ang working in Italy for French patrons there during the same time frame. Right? This is all part of Napoleon's ambition to become emperor. Now, obviously, it didn't work out. Right? He almost got there were it not for the Brits, the Duke of Wellington. They were having none of this. They're going to push back. And beginning in 1813, the British begin to push back against Napoleon, first driving him out of Spain, eventually deposing him in 1815. Right? But this is before all of that. This is when Napoleon is now extending his influence, extending his political reach throughout all of Europe. Okay? Goya stays in Spain. He was originally the court painter to Carlos. He then goes to work for the French. I think it's because he feels himself to be this outsider looking in. He doesn't really care, right, about nationalism and patriotism. And he begins to work for the French while they are occupying Spain. And then when the Spanish came back into power, right, when the Spanish throne is re-established in 1814, Goya wants to prove that he was just trying to look out for himself. That he didn't really have it in for the French, and he really is a deeply nationalistic, patriotic Spaniard. Right? And he asked to paint these pictures for the return of the Spanish king. And they're huge, right? He paints a pair of these pictures that document the horrors of war that the French had visited on Spain. Right? So what we see here is the aftermath of the uprising, where the French troops have gathered up the rioters, right, who are really, from a French outlook, the whole reason the French are there, right? They're actually helping, in a way, the French. And what the French troops have done is they've gathered them up, they've led them outside the walls of Madrid in the middle of the night. But we know it's a night scene from the sky. We can see a huge box lantern there that's illuminating the scene, right? And they're leading them outside the city to just kill them all as part of the institution of French rule. Now, for Goya, right, this scene is absolutely horrific. And it, again, fits with this idea of our ability to do extraordinarily horrible things when we're irrational. Right? Man's ability to kill his fellow man for no real apparent reason. These are innocent victims. They're not fighting back. And they're being killed by this nameless force. We see them all from the back, right? This line of guns slaughtering these people, and this line of people leading back into the deep distance. Show up, get shot. Show up, get shot. It's a mechanization of murder. Right? And Goya is focusing on that, trying to give us the sense that our Spaniards on the left are the innocent victims of the horrors of war. Right? That's the message he's trying to get across. And as we look at the image, we see that the people that are huddled in the darkness of night, they're terrified, quite like the children in Here Comes the Boogeyman, one of his prints. Right? They are the impoverished, They are the religious. The man in the foreground is a Franciscan monk, right, dedicated to a life of peace. The figure in white, looking quite like Jesus on the cross, and wearing the white of innocence, right? All of these are in Goya's bag of tricks to make us sympathize with them, right? And it's highly, highly dramatic. It's the moment before the shot, right? It's that, do you ever watch movies when somebody pulls out a knife or an axe or something, and you just go like, oh, I don't want to see this, because you know something horrible is going to happen, right? And that's the case here, right? This is the moment before that white shirt just erupts in red. And Goya wants us to sympathize with them and understand that these are the good people. We see their faces. We see their individuality. We see their fear. The French troops are the bad people. We don't see their faces. They're the nameless machine of war, right? And this is now to instigate his return to Spanish society, right? Being a romantic picture, and this is something we see in romantic, it's horrifying, right? It's gory for a 200-year-old picture, right? It's still deeply unsettling to look at these things. He sticks the dead right down center, and this picture is huge. It's about twice as big as my image on the screen. It's about as big as this entire screen. That's a monster picture. It's meant to be hung inside of an arch that the troops would walk through, right, on one side of the arch. So it's meant for public display, and we have these life-size figures in the foreground that are just washed in blood. And the wounds for us to see, and it's hard to look at, but also kind of hard to look away from. It makes an extraordinary, visceral impact. And it points to something that is a new way of looking at art in the Romantic period. There's a philosophical term for this called the sublime. This was first written about in the late 18th century. You probably heard the term before, but probably misused. When the term sublime was coined to talk about art, it was an aesthetic experience, right? That means it could be visual, it could be oral, right? It could be... The sublime was an extraordinarily powerful aesthetic experience that you simply could not forget. And aesthetics prior to that had often talked about the aesthetic experience as being pleasing, right? Beauty. When we think about aesthetics, we think about beauty, right? Harmony, perfection, proportions, right? The sublime suggests that there's more to aesthetics than beauty. That aesthetics is about perception, powerful perceptions, and that things can have a powerful aesthetic experience that are not beautiful, that are in fact ugly, horrifying, and that this can have as strong an impact as anything that's beautiful. It's a sort of non-judgmental approach to images like this. This is a sublime image. Goya's intent is to make an image that has a lasting impact on you, the viewer. His issue is not to make a beautiful picture, right? It is consciously ugly. And as we look at romantic art, we're going to see a lot of artists that are interested in this idea of the sublime, the extraordinarily powerful aesthetic experience that sometimes can be revolting, right? And prior to this period, we don't see that. We really don't have elements. Your picture, maybe. He's kind of ugly, right? But they hadn't really articulated this yet, right? This idea. Although, obviously, there's roots for these things. From this point forward, however, we think about expressionist art, right? Sometimes there are works of art that are kind of consciously ugly. And the point is to hit us over the head and make us sort of snap out of it and listen, right? Look up and notice. So I've got some things coming up that are, right? So this was painted after the war, right? Between the French and the Spanish, and after the Spanish control. During the war, while Goya is painting portraits of various French invaders, he's also making sketches. of what's going on around him. And he turns these into a series of prints that he doesn't issue during his lifetime because they're too politically charged, showing the horrors of war, what happened during the French occupation, right? And these are utterly sublime and utterly horrifying, documenting the evil that men can do, right? In all of its horror, right? Great, and with these silly titles, right? Great heroism, and it's obviously meant to be totally ironic, right? With dead men, bodies dismembered and strung up in trees. These are things that Goya saw during the war between the Spanish and the French. And he illustrates them for us to document these horrors. I always have this thing, we talk about people behaving like animals when they do horrifying things. And that's not right. Animals don't do that. Animals don't kill each other for no apparent reason. Right? It might be about territorialism, it might be about food, but the idea of sort of displaying your dead, that's what humans do. That's what sets us apart. We're capable of this sort of horror. And for a romantic artist, right, interested in sort of documenting our irrationality, right, the place where we're free from the bonds of rules and whatnot, these become kind of interesting images. Not that we should follow them, not that we should model our behavior after this, but we should understand that it's something that is there that we need to deal with. Right? In France, another sublime image, this idea of the sublime is everywhere, is in this extraordinary painting by Géricault, The Raft of the Medusa, where we see a relatively contemporary news story. And that's kind of an interesting thing here. This goes back to Khadijah's question, right? How many news events are we seeing, right? The Watson and the Shark, right? The 3rd of May news events, right? And contemporary news events. And here, this happened in 1816. There was a boat named the Medusa, right? Named after the goddess with the snakes in her hair. That was off the coast of Senegal, right? And shipwrecked. And there were 150 survivors went into the ocean. And they took the shattered hull of the ship and they fashioned it into a raft for 150 people, right? And they floated at sea for 10 or 12 days. And by the end of it, there were only 15 left. So 1 in 10 survived from the people that actually lived through the shipwreck, right? And we see here the very end of their turmoil, where they're trying to signal the rescue ship to come to the raft, with a few survivors left of the 150 that originally survived the boat wreck, right? 2 of the survivors wrote an account of what happened, and it was published in the press, and to great sort of acclaim and recognition. And Géricault is interested in sort of capitalizing on that popularity of that story, right? And uses it as the basis for his picture, right? Now, the story is filled with horrors. Not only are the people struggling to survive, struggling against the power of nature for their individual survival, but also about people losing it, just becoming irrational, not focusing on the good of the group, but their individual interests. It's filled with disgusting details of things like, well, there's overthrow of the captain, right? Mutiny, cannibalism to stay alive, obviously gangrenous bodies on the raft, right? And that's exactly what Géricault uses for his image. Piling, again, right along the front border, the dead and the dying. The struggling against the powers. There's a man holding the body of his son, trying to keep him from falling over. There's another figure whose head disappears into the water off to the right. And this, again, is a monster picture. It's huge, 18 feet across or so. I got a picture of it in situ. Apparently half a body of a man on the left, right? All of it as horrifying and gut-wrenching as it can possibly be. I've got some details. One of the things that Jericho did while working on this, he's painting it in the studio, is he brought in cadavers from the medical school to use for the bodies. And he posed some of his students as well. And there are some paintings of the severed heads by Jericho that he got from the med school to use for this. I didn't bring them in because they're really disgusting. Right? Maybe I should have. Next time. Neighbors upstairs complained about the stench coming from the bodies. And he talked about the fact that he needed them there to keep him in the right sort of frame of mind to paint this thing, right? Showing us the sort of the horrors of irrationality on the raft of Medusa, and using that contemporary news story as the basis for an investigation of these very, very romantic themes. Right? He gives us the moment before rescue. And we can see just on the end of the horizon, just tiny little ship out there. And by choosing this particular moment, right? Is there any way that boat has seen them yet? Right? We can barely see the boat. And there's no way that look how tall the wave is on the left. Right? They're sort of down in a wash, and as they come up over the waves, it tips up the raft so we can see it, but at the same time, the waves are crashing over the top of the boat. And there's almost like, at this point, if you don't know this story, there's no hope whatsoever. Right? This is an extraordinarily hopeless scene. Right? And Jericho intends this picture to be a political allegory. There's how big it is, right? Just so you have a sense of scale. Right? This is a huge picture. It's put in the Salon in 1819, and Jericho intends it to make a huge splash. This is another of these pictures where artists are using art to affect opinion, right? Is it propaganda? Not exactly, because it doesn't bend the truth entirely, right? But it certainly is intended to have an effect on people's thoughts. And the story is that the captain, right, as they wrote, the two survivors write the story of what happened to the raft of the Medusa, the aftermath of the shipwreck. One of the things they said is that this was entirely avoidable, that it was all due to the fact that the captain was entirely incompetent, right? That he was unable to navigate the storm, ended up breaking the ship up off the rocks, yada, yada, yada. It was the captain's fault. And had he been a better captain, none of this would have happened. That was part of the narrative that Jericho was working from. Okay? Now, that captain had been appointed through nepotism. Right? He was chosen because he was friends with the man who appointed him. And now I got to get into French history a little bit to make this clear. Okay? The person who had appointed it was the King of France. Now, you might say, but Mark, what's with the King of France? We had a revolution. Got rid of him, right? What happened was, in French history, right, the first revolution of 1789 led to the terror, right, beheadings, so forth, and the idea of trying to establish, right, representative government. And they bring Napoleon back, general in Italy, 1799. They bring him back to France to appoint him as first consul, right, to France. Well, elected post with a term. And he crowns himself emperor in 1803, okay? So they end up with worse than what they had before, and has all these ambitions of conquering all of Europe, right, 1803. And for the next 12 years, that's exactly what Napoleon does. We saw him moving into Spain. We talked about the fact he'd already been in Italy, right? Spreading his influence, political control, over the entire continent. Right? Obviously, the British don't like this, and they begin to fight back under Duke of Wellington. Right? And they first push Napoleon out of Spain, and then they push him further, sort of back toward Belgium. Battle of Waterloo, right? 1815. Napoleon's deposed, right? What happens to France after Napoleon is deposed is they decide, not all of them, but some that are in control decide to reinstitute the monarchy. To go back to the way it was before the revolution, because what happened with the revolution, it gave us Napoleon. So let's go back, let's just hit reset, right? Start over again. Louis XVIII, sort of a cousin of Louis XVI, who had been beheaded, right, the husband of Marie Antoinette, is put back on the throne, right? So France goes back to the way it had been, okay? This is a period we call the Restoration. Right? For 14 years after the downfall of Napoleon at Waterloo, we have the French monarchy returning, right? Restored to the throne, the Restoration. Right? And the first Restoration monarch is Louis XVIII, okay? On the throne in 1816 through to, I forget, somewhere in the 20s, 24 or so, right? Where he's succeeded by his son, okay? Now, come back to our picture. The captain of the Medusa was appointed by Louis XVIII, was a friend of the king. Unskilled, not a particularly strong resume, right? Put there by royal command. And many people reading the account of what happened to the Medusa, right, looked at it and said, this is a sign that the monarchy is not a good idea. This is a sign that the new monarchy is just as unconcerned with the people as the old monarchy had been. Right? Remember Marie Antoinette, let him eat cake? Right? New monarchy is just as bad. Right? They don't give a rip about the common man, to the point that they're just simply appointing in these executive posts people at their whim that are in fact harming people. Right? Now, even though the monarchy is back in control after 1816, not everybody supports them. Right? There are still revolutionary factors out there. And France is divided between the royalists on the one side, those who would support Louis XVIII, his son Charles X, and those who are anti-royalist. Did you ever read Count of Monte Cristo? I read it. It's a kid's book, and I read it for the first time like a couple years ago. It's all set during this time of the rise of the royalists versus the anti-royalists in this restoration period. Okay? Jericho was an anti-royalist. His entire family was anti-royalist. Right? This picture is intended as an anti-royalist picture, trying to show the inhuman suffering that is a direct result of royal ineffectiveness. If it weren't for Louis XVIII appointing this captain, the Medusa would never have wrecked. That's the message of the picture, and on a huge scale. Right? Now, he could easily, if criticized, put it off as just a painting of a news event. But for those who wanted to sort of whisper campaign, right, talk about what this really means, that is what they would talk about. Right? Was its political overtones. And Jericho's not alone, right? A number of artists are making pictures that have really, really strong political overtones. Again, art as a socially engaged endeavor. Delacroix, was one of Jericho's pupils. What I've read is that he was one of the models that posed for the Raft of the Medusa. That we can find him in there somewhere if we look hard enough. Right? And this is now 8 or 9 years later. We're still during the Restoration, where Delacroix gives us a scene from ancient history. And again, it's a scene of irrational behavior, very romantic, that also carries a strong political allegory. Okay. So the story of Sardanapalus goes back to the 7th century BC, ancient Assyria, where King Sardanapalus is in his temple, in his palace, and the palace is under siege by one of his enemies. And Sardanapalus decides that he can't win the battle. He's going to have to surrender. And he decides at the last minute that he does not want his enemies to have any of his possessions. So he issues an edict that everything that he owns will be brought to his throne room. All of his jewels, prized horses, women from his harem, so the story went, right, would be brought to his throne room, and he would set it all on fire. So that everything would be destroyed rather than let his enemies have it. Right? And that's the scene that Delacroix gives us here. It had recently been the subject of a play by Byron, Lord Byron, so that's part of what's fueling this interest in the story. And again, it's a massive picture. The figures that you see are life-sized, right? And we see this moment of horror, of terror, of this irrational behavior, of destroying others for your own, well, certainly not for your own profit, right? Just so that the enemies won't have these things. This jeweled horses being brought and aware of their fate with their eyes bolden as they're fighting against this. The king, Sardanapalus, rings on his toes, decadent, extraordinarily wealthy, and out of touch, unconcerned with the suffering that he himself is causing. Now, it's obvious to see how this is a metaphor, right? A king out of touch with the suffering he is causing becomes an allegory for, within anti-royalist circles, an allegory for what's going on in France, what they believe is going on. And you won't be surprised to find out that there is, in fact, a second revolution, only a few years off, in 1830, right? We will have a second revolution against the Restoration monarchs. France will eventually have 3 different revolutions, right, in the course of about 50 years. So this is leading up to that. A king out of touch, willing to sacrifice his subjects for his own personal ideas, right? And those subjects begging for mercy. We've talked about Orientalism on Monday. We talked about this issue of this ideology of Orientalism, this concept of viewing non-Western cultures in a negative light that supports Europe's idea of cultural superiority, which is especially important at a time when Europe is expanding its dominance, expanding its control, particularly around the Mediterranean and particularly over Arab countries. In this case, Sardanapalus becomes another representative of this French Orientalism, where we see a decadent, deviant king, taken from history, ostensibly accurate, historically speaking. But it fits into this idea of Orientalism when we talk about the images that artists in Europe illustrate of Arab life, whether it's contemporary or ancient. Those stories are a fairly limited group of themes, and each one of them is meant to emphasize the difference between that culture and Europe, that those people behave differently than us. And the difference is a difference of civilization, as the Europeans would have it. That Arab culture is uncivilized, as opposed to European culture. And they need, so the ideology would say, they need the civilizing influence of Europe. And this picture fits into that broader category of Orientalism, right? Where we can see the figure holding the woman and driving the sword deep into her chest from the neck downward. Right? Now, 3 years later, Delacroix would actually go to Algeria. France had colonized Algeria beginning in 1830, and they remained the political controllers of Algeria, the leaders of Algeria, all the way to 1962, all the way to my lifetime, right? That colonization did not end for over 130 years. And Delacroix gets a chance to go, and he fills these sketchbooks with drawings of North African culture that he uses as the basis for his works. He's already been interested in it before he goes. Now he has the opportunity to fill his pictures with accurate illustrations of costumes and people based on things he's seen from life. And he continues to use these sketchbooks for the rest of his life as the basis for paintings. He does other kinds of paintings as well, but orientalizing pictures reappear in Delacroix's output all the way until his death. This is 33 years later. This is the year he died, 1863. And he's using these sketchbooks to give us another kind of orientalizing scene. So far, we've seen sort of sexual deviance, or how the Europeans would label it, right? Harems, Sardanapalus. Here we see Arab violence. Again, another attempt to characterize Arab culture in a particular way. And believe me, when we look at these European images of Arab culture, they are always chosen from such a limited group of thematic choices. Warfare, sexualization, really typify almost all of it. As a romantic picture, it puts violence front and center. We see these cultures engaged in sort of tribal warfare, for lack of a better word, and focusing again on this irrational activity of fighting against each other. And again, as a romantic picture, putting some of this violence right down in front. Now, this is a fairly small picture. It's only about like yay, as opposed to our massive Sardanapalus picture. But it still has that same romantic effect, right, of focusing on irrational behavior, but again, overlaying it with this idea of Orientalism. On Tuesday, we'll wrap up Romanticism by looking at images of landscape pictures, and then we'll move on from that to sort of getting closer to the Impressionists, coming up very, very soon. Remember that next week, no classes on Thursday and Friday, right? Next week's Easter. So you have no classes on Thursday and Friday or Monday, but on a week from Tuesday, we have class, because there's too many Monday classes that get canceled, right? So a week from Tuesday is an academic Monday. So if you have work issues, be sure you get them straightened out, because we have class on Tuesday, a week from next week.
I borrow a pencil, do you have one?
Yeah, I got a very, very swanky fountain pen. If you break it,
I see the right
cost you your life.